Okay, I had a little technical glitch, but no big deal. So we broke this into 3 videos, and what I want to really do here is get at the historical context of the second discourse, which means talking about the 2 things. The first discourse, have the arts and sciences led to the moral progress of mankind? And then also a look at our main theme here, which is natural man and civilized man. And that discussion of this distinction between natural man and civilized man in part 1 of the discourse is really unintelligible unless we see it in this historical context. So, as we saw that Rousseau's thought happens within the context of the Enlightenment, and they essentially thought reason could liberate society from its historical ills, its historical problems, economic, in terms of health and medicine, right? Obviously, we've seen the advancement of medicine, technological, but also moral. Rousseau was the first thinker of the Enlightenment to say, you're going to get all these developments, absolutely, and I can see it with my own eyes. I can see the transformation of society, but in fact, if knowledge of the world, scientific knowledge, is power, that power is going to not be in the hands of the ordinary person. It's going to be in the hands of government. And unless, of course, you have a just government, you're actually giving the government the keys to tyranny rather than to liberty, which virtually all Enlightenment thinkers saw as central to a more just social and political order. And in this thinking, as I said in the first video, that central to this thinking, it was nothing new, and that he actually relies on some really old thoughts coming out of Genesis and Greek mythology. Now, the first is the story of Prometheus and Pandora. Prometheus gives fire from the gods to mankind, and if you read the myth of Prometheus, what happens is then when mankind is given fire, they develop technologically, they develop an easier life, right? Creature comforts and the well-being from a much more laborious and difficult situation. So they're liberated in exactly the way the Enlightenment envisioned it in its very broad outlines. Scientific and revolution for the conquest of nature and the relief of man's estate, right? The betterment of the human condition, right? However, in the story of Prometheus, after the god has given mankind fire, Zeus then mets on the human beings Pandora, and her Pandora's box unleashes all types of things like plagues and destructive forces that undo the work and are seen as a direct consequence of the liberation that came from the fire. So it puts in the myth of Prometheus, the fire is understood as technology. It literally is technology. It's if you look at human history, fire was one of the most significant technologies in advancing human civilization. Protection, cooking food, warmth, and on and on and on. Right? Genesis, I'm sorry. But fire is also a metaphor for basic human ingenuity, the ability to devise things that then allow us to live easier and to conquer or to control and constrain the forces of nature, so that the world we live in is the product of our own making rather than the product of just the natural world. Can we conquer chance? Can we conquer nature? Can we control, through the power of science and technology, our own destinies? Right? That's one of the great questions of the modern era that's still being implicitly raised and asked. The other story, after Pandora mets out her destruction on the human species, is the Genesis story of Adam and Eve picking from the fruit of the knowledge, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Right? What is the one prohibition that Adam and Eve have in the garden? The prohibition against knowledge, and particularly moral knowledge. But as we discover in that story, even moral knowledge, what is to say between right and knowledge of what is right and wrong, good and evil, just and unjust, also turns out to be technical knowledge, because when they get the moral knowledge or the wisdom from the tree, They then go on to do things like fashion things for themselves. They make themselves clothes. And then their son, Cain, goes out and founds a city, right? And connected with the city is both, say, political order, religion, but also technological, the development of the arts and sciences, which is exactly what we're talking about here. So God, now many rationalists and atheists will immediately criticize the story, but God seems to think that human beings are better off without knowledge, or without certain types of knowledge, because that knowledge and that reasoning can actually be counterproductive to their own well-being. And this is exactly the position Rousseau took, that there may be certain types of knowledge that are not good, and therefore reason and knowledge are not an unmitigated and absolute good at all, that they have serious downsides, and that one needs only to think and inquire about that. Okay, but the Enlightenment really disagreed as a whole. And let's just to clarify what the Enlightenment is. It was a broad intellectual movement throughout Europe and America that sought to cure the ills of society and the individual through the application of unaided reason to all its problems, to every aspect of society. As its name implies, it sought to enlighten society at large. And enlighten here means to use reason to liberate minds that are shackled to superstitions, to myths, to falsehoods, and also more generally to just give them knowledge that they never, and facts about the world that they never had access to. So some of the ignorance was incurred by the religious and political order, but some of it was just the result of you have to go out and discover things to know the facts to begin with. The goal was to liberate them from the darkness of ignorance. So you see this metaphor of dark and light being taken as darkness as ignorance and light as a kind of rational spotlight or flashlight on the world around them. So this was an intellectual revolution, and literally a revolution has to do with the earth rotating, the sun coming up, and it's literally a revolution is a shift from dark to light. And of course, if you think what a revolution literally is, it's turning, right? So here we're taking this term fairly literally. So when you think of a political revolution, it's a turn or a shift from one form of government to another. And in the ancient world, there was understood as a whole cycle of regimes that naturally nation states, city states went through in the course of their development over time. The Enlightenment sought to bring the received and unexamined opinions and traditional beliefs of society before the tribunal of reason as judge of their validity, worth, and truthfulness. In general, the Enlightenment thinkers of France and elsewhere believed that all facets of society, religious, moral, political, economic, and scientific, should be scrutinized by reason so that society could literally be remade, refashioned. This is an intellectual revolution that results in a political revolution, a moral revolution, an economic revolution. So capitalism is one of the big things that develops, or at least the modern form of capitalism, particularly as it developed in the 18th and 19th centuries. You think of the works of Adam Smith. He published his work on the Wealth of Nations, famous work that's kind of foreshadows capitalism, in 1776, the very year of the beginning of the American Revolution. In particular, the Enlightenment attacked the church as the prime source of irrational superstitions on which the injustices of society were founded. Now, that was particularly the case because the throne, the throne of the king, and the altar, which is just to say the church, worked hand in glove in order to control and enforce this highly unequal, and from Rousseau's point of view, unjust, and from our democratic point of view, unjust society, right? And if Rousseau believes in the intrinsic equality of human beings, then certainly his conclusion is that there's going to have to be a political system that manifests that equality in one form or another, and it might well be democracy. So, riffing or thinking in the vein of the Genesis story and the picking of the fruit and what that really means metaphorically, and thinking of the Prometheus and Pandora myth Rousseau is concerned to highlight the neutrality of technology, that technology is power, right, in the form of tools that enhance our power. Of course, power can be used for good or for ill. And of course, we know the expression that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. If power is not properly constrained, then people will abuse it, because power gives them ability to do things that they wouldn't otherwise be able to do. And they do it on who? They do it on the people who don't have the power. In the first discourse, Rousseau says this. He says, the sciences, letters, and arts spread garlands of flowers over the iron chains of political power and make people love their slavery. Right? What does he mean there? When he talks about the sciences, the letters, and arts, he talks about all those things that make us a civilized society. And by that I mean from the cultural context or the cultural perspective of all the things that make us feel like we are very high-minded and we live a life superior to others. And in particular, culture, like popular culture. For us, it would be film and sport and the internet and all these things in pop music. But for them, it would be things particularly like the theater. The theater was the popular art form of the 18th and the 19th century. It makes them love their slavery. Why? Because we all know what all this pop culture is. It's entertainment. It distracts us and detaches us from seeing what's going on in the world because we're paying attention to these superfluous things. And therefore, it gets us to accept the injustices of society because we have this kind of drug called pop culture that kind of puts us to sleep and gives us a kind of drug, a kind of psychic drug to distract us. Rousseau says need raises up thrones, and the sciences and arts have consolidated them. So the thrones create the chains of injustice, right? And the arts conceal the chains with flowers, making it look like something you really want, when in fact you don't. Need raises up thrones. Human nature has a need of government, right? What is government but the greatest reflection on human nature? We need government because we can't regulate ourselves, because passions do not conform to reason and justice without external constraint, as Hamilton says in the Federalist Papers. And the sciences and arts have consolidated. We need a power structure. What, by definition, government we talked about as a monopoly of power. It's one way to think about it. It's certainly not the only, but inevitably it's a source of power and authority. They have the lawmaking authority. They have the law enforcing authority. And that what science does is it only amplifies their power. And then the arts sedate us and make us accept that power, right? So you think of the Matrix, for example. Those human beings are in a radical power structure in which they are literally enslaved to these little kind of tubes, almost like test tubes, where they're being used for energy. And the Matrix is a virtual reality to seduce them. It's so seductive they're not even aware of their true reality. But of course, the Matrix for us is the computer and the internet and movies and Hollywood and all this bullshit that really distracts us from what really goes on in the world. And it kind of says, look here and not over here. Don't look at your chains. Look at American Idol or The Masked Singer, right? I mean, you've got to be kidding me, right? The technique is clearly to distract you from what's going on in the world, because that stuff is such crap, to be perfectly honest. The sciences and their technology have consolidated and amplified the power of the state. Meanwhile, the liberal arts, like theater and pop culture, have given people entertainments and divertissements. A divertisement is like a pleasant distraction from like the labors of everyday life. So we all understand why we go home at the end of the week and turn on the television. To distract us from what's truly important, and it lulls us into accepting our change. So it should sound familiar. So here he makes abundantly clear that he sees our corruption is in proportion, he says, as the arts and sciences have advanced toward perfection. So it's very simple. As the arts and sciences develop toward perfection, our corruption, our unhappiness only gets more dramatic, because what is it? Society is found on injustice, and the arts and sciences only perpetuate that fundamental injustice. You can already see the revolutionary implications of Rousseau's thought. You can see in the 1750s, he's already thinking about political revolution that would alter this whole makeup. A few more examples just to make it very clear. He says in the first discourse, the cultivation, the development of the sciences corrupts a nation's morals. Right? Full stop. This is what I dare to maintain. This is what I dare believe. I have proved. But how could I say that science and virtue could have done this? So he understands how radical a position he's taking. He understands that this is a man who's going against the grain of his whole time. It's a man who's going against the grain of his own society. He says, I knew that the sciences corrupt morals, render men unjust and zealous, and cause them to sacrifice everything to their self-interest and vainglory. Now this is really key, because the first discourse pinpoints that the arts and sciences corrupt human morals. They corrupt human happiness. They corrupt our souls and our psychology. In the second discourse, he's going to explain the historical process by which that he believes that happened. And this sentence here, that the science corrupt morals and render men unjust, jealous, self-interested, and vainglory, is basically a preview of what we're going to see in the second discourse. But if the progress of the sciences and the arts has added nothing to our genuine felicity, now notice, what is genuine felicity? That is our happiness. He says the if is a conditional statement, but the if is answered with yes, that is the case. If it's added nothing to our genuine happiness, it has corrupted our morals. And if the corruption of our morals has injured purity of taste, what are we to think of the crowd of popularizers who have removed the difficulties that guarded the access to the temple of the muses? So who are we're getting in the weeds here a little bit, but the popularizers of the temple of the muses, those are the people involved in the Enlightenment, promoting science, right? That we take science for granted, that it is democratic and to be propagated to the society at large. Up until the period of the Enlightenment, it was understood that science was for a small community of people capable of handling science and being rational about things, and that it really wasn't the business of society at large. And of course, he thinks the very popularization of science has all kinds of negative consequences. A view that's very far from our thinking today, because we are all the children of the Enlightenment. Okay, so now we have this historical context in place, starting with the Enlightenment and its aspirations, and concluding with Rousseau's belief that in fact the Enlightenment is a profoundly corrupting influence. Part of his belief that it was a corrupting influence was not Enlightenment as such, but that it would have been in the hands, the fruits of the Enlightenment, the knowledge that led to the power that made possible the control over society, was in the hands of aristocracies and monarchies, right? There was a very common idea, and in fact his friend Voltaire believed in it. These people, most of them, were not sympathetic to a democratic government or republican government. They did not believe people were capable of governing themselves. And even the American founding, in the Constitution and the discussion around, deliberations around the Constitution, they were profoundly apprehensive of the extent to which people could truly govern themselves. And it was clear to someone like Voltaire that the ordinary people, what he called the canaille, and that meant rabble. Those were like the passionate and rude and vulgar masses, and that the only way to implement enlightenment was through what he called enlightened monarchy, or even enlightened despotism. So you have a wise, an open-minded, a progressive, reform-minded monarch, and there were some throughout Europe, who would be able to, in a kind of top-down way, implement the findings of the Enlightenment and benefit the people. And Rousseau says, sorry, but the problem is, if you're giving the power to this small group at the top, you're only going to reinforce the inequality and not liberate man in the way that I see is the truly just thing to do. Okay, so now we come to Rousseau's conception of the nature of man. And he, in the first part, is going to establish what natural man looks like and what he's all about. And then he's going to establish an image of civilized man, which is the result of the conventions of society, the habituation, the education, the indoctrination, the kind of training that we get in society that makes human beings what they are. What's fascinating is that this natural man is happy precisely because he's natural. And what's interesting is this man is so natural, he doesn't even have the power of speech. He is a primitive, or sometimes the word used in the text is savage. He's lacking in all civilization whatsoever, right? And we need to then ask ourselves, is this really a human being that has not developed speech and communication through speech and the society that comes with that? Is that even a human being at all? I mean, in body and form, it's a human being. But in terms of essentially what we are, it raises an interesting question. Furthermore, he poses that this natural man is by nature not social, or lives in an isolated fashion out in the woods, even prior to hunter and gatherer societies. So he's trying to paint a natural history of the human species, not unlike what we saw in the book Sapiens. The crux of the second discourse and its transformation of the human being and society from a natural, harmonious, and happy state to a corrupt state and an unhappy state is the transformation from one sentiment to another, a sentiment of love or self-love. It's a feeling of desire, and I think it can be more connected with the concept of eros than the concept of friendship, right? It's a form of self-love. So the word amour de soi-même literally means love of oneself. Soi-même means oneself. Amour propre, what is proper to a thing is what is one's own, what is related, what is connected to its identity. Property, which is where the word proper comes, property comes from the word proper, means things that are proper to you, and things that are proper to you are part of you. So amour propre is also meaning love proper to yourself, or love of self. But it also implies kind of a set of manners, like proper in the sense of decorum, proper in the sense of how one carries oneself in civil society. So the natural man is going to be a being of amour de soi-même, and civilized man is going to be a being of amour propre. What is amour de soi-même? We're going to talk about these things more at length, but it is a natural sentiment, which is to say, it is an instinctual sentiment that is not educated in us, but exists into us all individually in light of our being born as a human being. It's connected with natural man in a state of nature, and it is the sentiment of natural man. And in fact, we're going to see amour de soi-même has a couple related passions, but they're all built around related concepts of the desire for self-preservation, and the pleasure that comes from self-preservation, the pleasure of being alive, and then also the sentiment or the passion of pity, which is an ability to identify with other beings that are like us, and we see ourselves. To say we identify with something else is to say we see ourselves in it, and therefore can understand by extension what's going on in that other being, because we put ourselves in its shoes because they are like us and we identify that. And therefore, since they are like us, self-love means love for yourself and things like you, that you feel pity, you feel compassion, form of compassion for them. which is going to be, pity is going to be the sentiment that keeps natural man peaceful and harmonious with other human beings, rather than a state of conflict, rather than the state of war that Hobbes describes in The State of Nature. So for Rousseau, and it's very explicit in part 1 of the second discourse, he explicitly disagrees with Hobbes, saying that the natural condition of man is not warlike, but it is peaceful. And in fact, the warlike world that you depict is precisely a product of civil society and precisely the product of the development of amour-propre. Okay, amour-propre, the sentiment or the feeling of love of a civilized person, is a conventional sentiment developed in you through society. Society takes the natural sentiment of sexuality, takes the natural sentiment of familial love or paternal love, and transforms it with its ideas into something else for the purposes of not you, but society. And this is where one of the conflicts comes in. We saw that in the Republic, one of the fundamental themes running throughout the entire Republic, the problem with justice, is the conflict between the interest of the individual and the interest of the community, right? Amour de soi-même is your feeling of love. Amour-propre is built up around the interests and demands and needs of society as a collective, and then imposed on the individual. And what society imposes on you, what society, this is going to be something you're very familiar with, what society tells you you should want, white picket fence, kids, car, job at this point, career at that point, and on and on and on. What society tells you you should want may be in conflict with what you really believe you desire for yourself. Before we look specifically at these two kind of stereotypes of man, primitive man and in a state of nature and civilized man, let's just get a clearer account of this historical trajectory. He's trying to explain the origins of inequality. He's going to do it through a historical story that starts in prehistory, before humans have speech, before they have writing, and end up in his own day in the 18th century, where he sees as the pinnacle or the zenith of human inequality, which is exactly why he's writing this, because he sees the injustices of his own society, and before he's going to solve them, this is what he does in his famous work called The Social Contract, where he tries to solve the problems of the injustices he sees. But in this work, the second discourse, his concern is to diagnose and identify the problems. We see a really crude trajectory, right? The development of the species, historical development of Western civilization to the 18th century in France and Europe. We start out with primitive man on the left, or natural man. His sentiment is amour de soi-même. He's born good and corrupted in society. This is something he'll say in The Social Contract, and something he'll say in another book on education called Emile. One of the great questions of the story he tells is, if man is naturally good, how could he possibly have become corrupt, right? And Rousseau has an answer for that, absolutely, because he knew the problem that entailed. In the 18th century, we have absolute monarchy. We have the stage of greatest injustice historically. Nobles versus commoners, masters versus slaves, the inequality of noble privilege. We see here in the middle, the increasing corruption of society as it goes through various historical stages. And the historical stages he identifies are the kind that historians and scholars would identify today. If it wasn't man's nature to be evil or to be corrupt or to be conflictual, what caused it? Here is his answer: a concatenation of fortuitous circumstances. A concatenation of fortuitous circumstances. This is the most lovely. I love words. This is great. Let's take each word in its time. Let's take the simplest. Circumstance. A circumstance is an environmental cause that is external to you and your nature, that impinges on you and clearly forces some type of change over time, right? The circumstances he talked about were ones, well, I don't want to, ones of terrain, ones of climate, and one of physical proximity to other human beings. In a state of nature, primitive man lived an isolated and basically a kind of hermetic existence by himself in the woods. And is this the truth about human species? Did we start out as asocial and became social and corrupt? I think most anthropologists and people who study this would say no, that the human being has always been social, even before we had modern speech starting 100,000 years ago, and so on and so forth. So circumstances, external factors cause this. Fortuitous. Fortuitous, this is really crucial for Rousseau. It means accidental, or based on fortune or chance, right? There's good fortune and there's bad fortune, right? Chance means something outside of your control, number one. And chance also implies it could have been different. It could have been different. This is why he does not want to pin all this corruption on human nature. He wants to say, had history developed in a different way, had human beings lived under slightly different circumstances, we may have developed a society that was more just, that was more equal, that reflected our natural equality. However, for various reasons, it didn't happen that way. So for fortuitous, by chance. And then last one, the hardest word, but actually the most simple, and it's meaning concatenation. A concatenation just means like a convergence, a simultaneous convergence of many factors that all contributed to creating the circumstance of mankind's corruption. That they all kind of came together, you might say, in a perfect storm. That concatenation is a kind of a series of variables all having their own relative impact, and cumulatively they result in this fundamental shift in human psychology and human social order. In the text, he gives, and this really starts in part 2 of the text, he gives very specific moments in history and explains the mechanisms by which the corruption of our species happened. So if you look at the bottom of the page here, you see key historical developments. So what were they? They started out, well, I'll give you the answer right now. What is the thing that led to the society we have? Interestingly enough, it's increased proximity to one another. Now you say, how did that do that? That's a good question, because he has a very clear answer. In the state of nature, savage or primitive man basically lived, or pre-civilized, lived an isolated existence. When he or she acted, it's like a kid playing in the forest and forgetting that they have a family or mother and father or brothers and sisters or friends, and they're just out in the woods all by themselves, and they lose sight of their social connections, right? This pre-civilized man only saw their lives through their own eyes, right? So therefore, when they performed all their actions, when they thought about their desires and their needs, it was only from their own point of view. They were never looking over the shoulder to see what the Joneses were doing. They never cared what other people were doing, because the only thing that mattered was their own desires, because those are the ones that were being generated by their own bodies, and they had to preserve and take care of their own bodies and not someone else's. They had to satisfy their own psychological needs and not someone else's. Eventually, mankind shifted from an isolated existence out in the forest, as he describes it, to one in which we're increasingly around other people. Now, how did that happen? Well, it happened through this concatenation of fortuitous circumstances. Some environmental event forced people to interact with one another rather than being isolated, and for an extended period of time, to the point where they started establishing living settlements like villages, households like we saw in Aristotle, and formed groups, and then established, this is key, group identity. You could be in a group and not identify as being a member of the group. The key thing is not only you around other people, but you start seeing yourselves as a community bound by what? Certain key life or death principles or ideas or ways of life that get established almost surreptitiously, almost invisibly over time. And you just all of a sudden realize that you're living in this coordinated way with other people. And it came out almost spontaneously. Now, then the question is, well, what's wrong with that? Rousseau says this: we start out performing our actions to satisfy our own needs. Very simple. Amour de soi-même. Our own self-love, our own desire for life. You might even think of amour de soi-même as just a general desire for life, a desire for living, and a desire for all the things that keep you alive, whatever they may be. And then you start realizing other people are pursuing similar desires, and you look at what they do, and they also look at you. And this is also key, that they become aware that you're looking at them, and you become aware that they're looking at you. Society becomes a spectacle of observers. And then once they realize it's a spectacle of observers, then not only are we observing, but we're acting. We know when we perform our deeds that we're being watched, and therefore we modify our deeds, we modify our desires based on what we think other people want of us, because we want to please them. Now, what's interesting in Aristotle's vision of the human nature, there was a part of the soul called thumos, spiritedness, which desired recognition from other people. Thumos was, by definition, a social desire, which Aristotle saw as entirely natural to the human species. It's part of our nature. It's not part of historical development. It's just there from the beginning. Rousseau says this desire for recognition from others, which actually ends up being the cause of our downfall, is a product of history rather than our nature, right? So then he starts talking about different moments in time that today are canonical periodizations of human history, from the hunter-gatherer society to agricultural society to the development of metallurgy connected with war and a more advanced form of technology. Most of human history, the most advanced technologies have been employed in war, and that's of course still true today. The most advanced technologies are pursued connected with the defense industry, the military-industrial complex. Right? So all these technologies are powers that can be used for good or ill, and he sees them as persistently corrupting society unless we have the proper form of regime, political organization, to account for them. So what's the key turning point? The key turning point in this history is the transformation of human sentiments, the human soul, and human nature itself, from a feeling of desire built around amour de soi-même to a desire of amour propre. One is generated by us, and the other is educated in us by society as we're looking over our shoulder and being concerned with the opinions of others. We'd call it popular opinion. We'd call it conformity. I'll give you an example. When you're in the bedroom in private with someone and you kiss them or show some sign of physical affection, you do it with just them in mind, and there's something more natural about it, right? But if people go out in public and make out on a subway car or a park bench, they're typically very aware that they're showing off for a third party, and that therefore that kiss is no longer about showing affection to another person. It is about demonstrating that they're, making out with a hot babe or a hot dude in public, and, my life is better than yours, and look what I'm doing, and you're just there all alone, crying in your beer, or something like that. You notice that the presence of the observer changes the act, and it changes the act from one desire, a more natural desire, to two desires. On one hand, we desire the person we're with, and on another hand, we want the recognition of being seen and getting attention from other people. And what is the key fortuitous circumstance that changes all this? Rousseau's simple answer is ongoing physical proximity. Society is a spectacle of other people watching us, and we internalize the view of others. Now, we saw this in Aristotle. Friends are the people whose view we internalize because we respect their judgment, right? Rousseau has a very different vision here of, that the true essence of our being means being in touch with our own kind of birth nature, right? Before everything is kind of covered over by civil society. And you can see in this story the birth of Freud's point of view, where to be psychologically healthy means to trace back to your childhood and to liberate yourself from all those moments in which society kind of piled on its demands of you and stole or concealed or oppressed or repressed your first nature. And if you can recover your first nature and still be in civil society, you can be happy. You can be well adjusted. So the transformation of mot de soi-même to amour propre is then the true origin of inequality. Now that's a radical claim. That is so fascinating. And when we start reading the text, we'll really see that. Now let's be clear. One thing that's obvious for Rousseau is that man by nature is equal, effectively, just like Hobbes had said. But yet he looks around in the society of the 18th century and sees radical inequalities. And his goal ultimately as a moral and political thinker and a psychologist will really be to solve those problems. He wants to solve the moral and political questions because he wants to get to the psychological question of human happiness and felicity versus the misery that he sees being suffered around him. And that it's a collective misery, right? It's not any one person. So some of the serious inequalities of his day that we would take for granted as great injustices, and rightly so, political inequality. There was absolute monarchy, which implied arbitrary power, which means there's no rule of law. What the king says is law, and if he says one thing one day and something that contradicts it on the next, then he's entitled to do that because he's king. All the power confined basically to the monarchy and aristocracy, a small elite, and they're the only people that wield political power. So when we're talking about political inequality, we're talking about the difference between those who actually wield political power and have a say in their own governance versus most of the people who don't. And of course, absolute monarchy, one of the most extreme anti-democratic forms of government you could have. Legal inequality that really flows, all these inequalities are really connected to one another, but the legal inequality really flows from political inequality. There's something called noble privilege, and noble privilege literally meant that aristocrats had rights and had a different code of law that peasants and commoners simply didn't have. There was no uniform rule of law. This was what we call a multi-layered or a two-tiered justice system, right? So the standard of justice and the laws that you were compelled to follow were different for a noble person versus a commoner. That, of course, the legal inequality leads to economic inequality. So one of the central components of noble privilege as a legal system was disparity in property rights, which is to say only nobility and aristocrats could own property. And that was something controlled by the king. Like the king could make people nobility and say, now I give you property rights and I'll grant you a swath of land if you do this for me. So commoners and peasants were not permitted to own real property like land, which was the primary basis of wealth in the 18th century, and therefore you have something like the kind of feudal system or the manorial system in which commoners are forced to work off the land of the nobility and basically pay rent for it because they can rent, but they're not renting to own because they will never be able to own. So therefore they're not quite slaves, but they're very close to it because they're constantly dependent on the people who own the property. And they just live basically a subsistence existence. And then connected with the first three forms is a basic inequality of recognition. It's a world, as Rousseau puts it, that consists of masters and slaves. Now, maybe serfs and peasants weren't literally called slaves, but they effectively were. And that the whole game of recognition was designed as a zero-sum game in which I benefit at your loss. If I'm going to be recognized as a master, it means I need people recognized as slaves who can recognize me as a master. He has a very fascinating psychological analysis of this that was picked up by Hegel, which is that every human knows or senses deep in their psyche that human beings are actually equal or effectively equal, and that the distinction of masters and slaves was an artificial one. It was purely the result of political and legal economic power. And therefore, the master's cruel treatment of the slave or the peasant or the serf was not just harmful to the slave, but also harmful to the master psychologically, who knew better, who knew that underneath the conventions of slavery or aristocracy was a fundamental equality. They knew in their own heart when they looked at the peasant or the slave that they were equal, and that what separated them were the trappings of society and the circumstantial benefits that one got and the circumstantial disadvantages that the other received. Now we'll look at some passages in the part 1 of the second discourse that clarifies the distinction of human beings by nature and human beings by convention. Rousseau makes it very clear in his other writings that he says, everything is good as it leaves the hands of the author of things. Everything degenerates in the hands of man. So society for Rousseau seems conventional. Man is not by nature social. He is made social through history. His nature, we're going to see, is malleable. He describes the human being as a free agent. And this is one of the great innovations of Rousseau's thought, that for Rousseau, in a way fundamentally different from ancient thought, medieval thought, Renaissance thought, Aristotle, that human nature was fundamentally changeable. And this is one way of accounting for this transformation from goodness to corruption, was that human nature is a kind of a blank slate that can become almost all things, and that its variability is much more dramatic than any previous thinker had really explored. So the author of things is either nature or God, right? And in the hands of man, everything degenerates, or is the word be corrupted, deteriorates, right? In Rousseau's second social contract, he says, man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. Have you ever heard a more revolutionary statement than that? Man is born free. And notice the kind of temporal context. That is a universal statement. Man is born free. All men are born free. Right? And then when he says, and everywhere he is in chains. Man is universally free, but when I look at 18th century Europe, I see that he is now currently in chains. Therefore, a fundamental injustice is being perpetrated against the human species, and therefore it needs to be rectified. You can see the writing on the wall of the French Revolution, and also, to a good extent, the American Revolution as well. So in the opening of the text, he's determined to assert the natural equality of human beings. And he says this, I conceive of two sorts of inequality in the human species. One I call nature or physical, because it is established by nature, and which consists in the differences in ages, health, strengths of bodies, and qualities of minds or the soul. Now you'll notice this is exactly identical to Hobbes, that there are powers or abilities of the mind and the body, and he's going to say that they're effectively equal. But he makes a distinction between natural abilities and the abilities or powers given to us by society. So think about it, like I'm a police officer who can carry around a gun, and if need be, I can shoot people in the way that an ordinary citizen can't. Now, that power that I had did not come from my mind. It did not come from my body. In a sense, it did not even come from my gun. It came from society that by convention granted me the right to kill someone in a circumstance that an ordinary citizen would not be permitted to perform. So when he starts talking about the inequalities created by convention, that's the kind of thing he's talking about. He says the other, which may be called moral or political inequalities, and I would call these conventional inequalities, because it depends on a sort of convention. What is a convention? It's just a kind of agreed upon rule. It's not something that exists by nature. It exists by the imaginative powers of human speech. And it establishes, or at least authorized by men's consent, right? So it's agreed upon. It's a convention. It's just a kind of status agreed by mutual consent. It consists in the different privileges. Remember, we talked about noble privilege. Privileges which some enjoy to the prejudice of others. That means some enjoy the privileges and others don't. And we might talk about here, what we're really talking about is a form of rights, right? By nature, our physical makeup, mind and body, we are equal. But in the political and moral world, right, of course, we don't really live just by our minds and bodies. We live by the powers created by society. Right? And in the political world, people are granted different rights that gives them different powers and authorities to do things that create disparities of power and therefore inequality. I'll read it again. It consists in the different privileges or rights which some enjoy to the prejudice of others, such as to be more wealthy, more honored, more powerful than they, or even to get themselves obeyed by them, right? So economic power, political power, one kind or another, is the result of the trappings of society. And it's all a kind of confidence game. A powerful person says something and you follow it because they've compelled you to believe that you must follow it. A governor tells you you can't open your business, you can't do anything. Right? Some people, you can't go to the beach even though you're 20 yards away from the next person. Some people go, okay, the governor has the power to do that. And other people go, excuse me, you don't have the power to control my business. You can't do that. I have the right to take risks I want. I wake up, I roll out of bed every day. I get in my car. Getting in my car is probably a greater risk than reopening my business right now. And yet you don't have any problem with me taking the risk of driving a car and killing myself or someone else. So the key thing is that authority figures need to be obeyed, right? And it's all a kind of confidence game to get you to believe that you should be following what they say to do. And of course, there are many mechanisms to enforce that. Just drive this point home about natural equality, since no man has a natural authority over his fellow, and force creates no right, we must conclude that conventions form the basis of all legitimate authority among men. Right? So authority means disparate power. One person has more authority, one person has less. And there is no natural authority. Let's put it another way, there is no natural superiority in mind or body over one another. So therefore, when I look out at society, this is key to his understanding of the origins of inequality. When I look out to society and I see inequality, I know therefore it can't come from the nature of any human being because we're naturally equal. Therefore, I'm going to search for the inequalities in the development of illegitimate and unjust conventions that place one human being over another. One is master, one is slave, one is king, one is serf, one is prince, one is pauper, and so on and so forth. In the second discourse, he says, I constantly hear it repeated that the stronger will oppress the weak. But explain to me what the word oppression means here. Some will dominate by violence, the others will groan, subjected to all of their whims. That is precisely what I see among us. But I do not see how the same could be said about the savage man. So he says, this is precisely what I see among us. He's talking about 18th century France and Europe in general. But I do not see how the same could be said about savage man, whom it would be even be rather difficult to get to understand what subjugation and domination are. You learn a lot about what savage man or primitive man, man in the state of nature is. What does he say civil society is in the 18th century? It's subjugation and domination, right? Control, oppression, inequality, the use of political power and other forms of power to control. He says savage man doesn't live this way. But he also says this: savage man wouldn't be able to even understand subjugation and domination. Subjugation and domination are created concepts of society. Now we talk about the sapiens, the creative power of language. Domination is not something naturally occurring. Subjugation and the desire to subjugate and dominate are not naturally occurring in human nature, in human desire. We do not have a natural desire to dominate. Hobbes says all human beings are equal, but it is our equality that brings us in conflict, right? And he gives the three sources of conflict, and one of them is the desire to dominate others. Rousseau says, you're right about the equality, but you're wrong that we have a natural desire to dominate our fellow man. We are naturally peaceful, harmonious beings who seek to leave each other mostly alone. Not that there isn't conflict, but there's not a desire to dominate that's going to result in a social structure of domination and subjugation on a long-term basis. Savage man is naturally peaceful then, right? He doesn't want to be master because he doesn't have a concept of being master. For Rousseau, master, slave, king, subject are constructs, right? He is one of the first thinkers to say these are not naturally occurring things. They are constructs of language. He talks a lot about language in the second discourse, and that's why, because language is the vehicle for the creation of these concepts that then are implemented in society and create all the injustices. But he says savage man wouldn't be able to understand them, and I think there's two reasons. Number one, savage man doesn't have full speech. And number two, since he doesn't have the natural desire to dominate, he literally cannot understand it. It's a nonsensical concept for him. So we now have this natural equality stressed, and exactly why natural equality exists, but also civil inequality. Now that we've established that Rousseau sees us as naturally equal, he gives us another insight into what he believes is the essence of human nature. And this is a really radical claim, a novel claim, a claim that no thinker or this thought had never really been taken to its to the logical conclusion of some of the darker and more interesting implications of it. But it's an idea that in the 19th and 20th century was very dominant, particularly, oddly enough, in totalitarian societies. He says at paragraph 15 on page 140, I see in any animal nothing but an ingenious machine to which nature has given senses in order to wind itself up and, to a point, protect itself against everything that tends to destroy or disturb it. I perceive precisely the same thing in the human machine, with the difference that nature alone does everything in the operations of the beast, whereas man contributes to his operations in his capacity as a free agent. The one chooses or rejects by instinct, the other by an act of freedom. As a result, the beast cannot deviate from the rule prescribed to it, whereas the human being can. Couple things. We're just a machine. He demotes us from our kind of exalted status, understanding of the biblical understanding of human creation and the special place we're given. And he doesn't precisely, he rejects to an extent what Aristotle says, that what separates us from the beasts or plants is reason. He says, rather, we are a free agent. Now, how that is to be understood, we could understand our act of freedom as based on our rationality, where it gives us the power to choose. But he doesn't talk about it here. Animals act on biological laws, chemical laws, physical laws. We may be a machine, but we have the free agent to choose. Not based on instinct, but to choose. Animals, in following instinct, do not choose. Right? So he identifies human nature with freedom, with our capacity to act freely. And this is really crucial. And this opens up, this means that history is not a foregone conclusion, and that the human species, political organization, social organization, moral thought can be different from what it is, because we're free to change it. And here, I'm not going to read all of this, but he talks about our perfectibility, Let's think back to what Aristotle had said about human nature. Human nature is given. We are a rational animal. Therefore, our full human nature is the full development and completion of our rational nature through education and experience and friendship. Full stop. And that our nature gives us the goal of our life. Therefore, when Aristotle talks about human perfection, he simply means the fulfillment of our intrinsic or raw abilities and developing them to the fullest extent we can. Rousseau's conception of perfectibility means simply the fact that we can become almost whatever we want, because we are a free agent, or a human life is defined by freedom. We can live, and when he's talking about we live not by instinct, he says we don't live by physical laws, we live by moral laws. And we've seen that moral laws are different throughout the world, and therefore we can live by almost an infinite variety of different moral laws. And that perfectibility really means malleability. We're not trending towards some specific end. Our nature does not dictate the end of our life. We can make ourselves. We are both the clay, but also the potter who can shape the clay, all within one. And it is a radically different vision of human. Up at paragraph 51, he says, having proved that inequality is scarcely perceptible in the state of nature, aka inequality is basically non-existent in the state of nature, and that its influence there is almost nil, it remains for me to show its origins. He's got to show the origins of inequality despite our natural equality, and its progress through the successive developments of the human mind. Notice the history he's telling here is not one of external events. It's the history of the human soul. It's the history of human psychology. This is what's so fascinating. And Rousseau makes Rousseau such a great psychologist, and we'll see this in our last lecture. Having shown that perfectibility, the social virtues, and the other faculties which natural man had received in potentiality could never develop by themselves, that in order to do so, they needed the fortuitous concatenation of several foreign causes, circumstances, which might never have arisen, and without which he would eternally have remained in his primitive condition. It remains for me to consider and describe to you and bring together the various contingencies that can have perfected human reason while deteriorating the species. Did you just hear that? Circumstances brought out potentials in human nature that may never have come out otherwise, right? Now, that's a point of view that most evolutionary biologists would say is absolutely right today. Everything is chance. There's no destiny in the human development of the human species. And that our natures were activated in a way to cultivate certain powers. It may have happened a different way if circumstances had been different. But notice, as reason is perfected, the species deteriorates, As reason is perfected, the species deteriorates. And why is that? Because reason can more and more uproots us from listening, we might say, to the voice of nature or to the voice of our own gut instincts. What Rousseau is really preaching here, in a sense, is the human being is most happy and most peaceful and most just when they follow their own heart. And I'm talking about on the individual level and the collective level, right? And notice the only way he can do this is to show us that the passions of human beings are fundamentally benign. If we naturally have destructive passions, following your own heart becomes a really bad idea. But unlike Plato, he does not see eros, natural eros, as intrinsically threatening. It's intrinsically good. Human nature, intrinsically good. It's only when circumstances bring out, you could say, the bad part of us. So he's just told us in the previous slide that if we're naturally equal, and yet here we are in the 18th century as unequal, it is on me, it is my obligation to explain to you how that happened. Now let's keep in mind Aristotle and most of the history of moral and political thought. The first principle of almost all moral and political thought up to Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau is this: all men are by nature unequal. The history of moral and political thought was something like, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are not created equal, and therefore political society should reflect those inequalities of nature, right? Think about what we saw in the Alexander Stevens speech. He said the old Constitution, based on the old Declaration of Independence, was wrong. It was based on human equality. And our society, our political institutions, must recognize the fundamental fact of human inequality as the cornerstone of our society. Exactly what he says. So Rousseau makes a really radical claim that inequality is conventional. And if it's only conventional, it's artificial. It's artificial. So now he's going to give a few paragraphs here where he really explains what sent humanity down the wrong road. And it's all about that fortuitous concatenation of several foreign causes or external circumstances. He says, in proportion as mankind spread. So what is he talking about here? He's talking about like the prehistory of human beings as they started to people the earth and migrate and form communities and so on and so forth, right? This is like the kind of discussion an anthropologist or an evolutionary biologist would be having. In proportion as mankind spread, difficulties multiplied together with men. Differences of terrain, climate, seasons could have forced, so it's a speculation, could have forced them to introduce differences in their ways of living. Barren years, long and harsh winters, scorching, all-consuming summers required renewed industry on their part. On seashores and riverbanks, they invented line and hook and became fishermen and fish-eaters. In forests, they made bows and arrows and became hunters and warriors. In cold countries, they covered themselves with the skins of the wild beasts they had killed. Lightning, a volcano, or some happy accident acquainted them with fire. A new source against the rigors of winter. They learned to conserve this element, then to reproduce it. And finally, to prepare the meats they had previously devoured raw. So all of this is really, is consistent with what academics and scholars would talk about today. But what do you see? You see physical differences of environment, terrain, climate, season, geography, force change in their moral customs, their habits, their ways of life. They have to come up with different sets of moral rules to adapt to different circumstances. And this theme was developed actually throughout the 19th, throughout the 18th, 19th, and 20th century in many ways. He says this repeated interaction of the various beings with himself as well as with one another must naturally have engendered in man's mind perceptions of certain relations. Notice how vague. Perceptions of certain relations. So repeated interactions. So let's be natural man in a state of nature. Savage man is by himself, isolated in the forest. Understands himself naturally to be independent. When he sees other people, he doesn't relate to them. He just recognizes them, but they're not part of his life. They're not part of his identity. I think home involves not just a place, but the other people who are part of your identity. You see yourself as dependent and your identity as an extension and dependent on others. You have a collective identity. So repeated interactions, the more we see one another, the more they become part of not just our life, but they become part of us. They become another self. They become, you might even say, our lost half. And then we recognize a dependency on others, that we can't exist without them because we're used to having them around. He says that these repeated interactions must have engendered in our mind's perceptions certain relations, as in we have a fixed relationship with these other people. What are those relations? It could be, oh, that's my family. Oh, that's my tribe. Oh, that's my nation. We're talking about the development of a collective identity, certain relations. He's very subtle here. He says the relations which we express with the words great, small, strong, weak, fast, slow, fearful, bold, and other ideas, compared as need required and almost without thinking about it, finally produced in natural man some sort of reflection, or rather a mechanical prudence that suggested to him the precautions most necessary for his safety. So what's the basic thing that motivates us? It's self-preservation, right? So that is the fundamental drive, the fundamental desire underlying these two forms of self-love: preservation in the natural world, and then self-preservation in civil society, which is no longer life and death preservation, but it's about trying to run the rat race and keep up with the Joneses and so on. So notice when we have these repeated interactions that establish certain relations that ultimately are going to lead to society and collective identity itself, we start making comparisons. This is really crucial. Amour de soi-même is a type of comparative desire in which our desires are shaped through our comparing ourselves to other people and modifying what we want based on either what we see they want or what expectations we think they have for us, because we become aware they're judging us. And so this is important, simple little comparisons of physical things, because it's going to ramify out into more significant things. Who's bigger, who's smaller, who's stronger, who's weaker, who's faster, who's slower, who's fearful and bold. And why do you need to know these things? Because you need to survive. And this is that gossip, descriptive information that you need to know about the world around you. You need to make these comparisons. They're natural for us to make, but we need to know the score. We need to know what's going on in our environment and what other people are like. He says the new enlightenment that resulted from this development. Now, here he's using the word enlightenment clearly to play off this major intellectual movement in Europe. But what he's speaking about more specifically is that the growing awareness in our minds of relating to other people, of having certain relations, of reflecting. Notice he talks about these comparisons are the result of our reflection on other people because they're in our physical proximity. The new enlightenment that resulted from this development increased his superiority over the other animals by acquainting him with it. So what happened? These comparisons with other people start activating our mental capacities, bringing those raw potentialities to life and cultivating them and developing in the same way that you raise a child and they start getting, they have intuitive or native knack for a certain thing, an innate knack, and then they develop it through a more formal process of practice or education, so on. He practiced settings setting traps for them. He tricked them in 1,000 ways. So we start using our own ingenuity, our own rational powers, against the other animals who have all types of physical attributes that are superior to our own, but we compensate by using our mind to overcome the physical advantages that they have. And you see the development. We could talk about this as the cognitive revolution here, right? From Sapiens. And everything he's just described gets at paragraph 9 on page 163. He says, this is how men might imperceptibly have acquired some crude idea of mutual engagements. Now, the important there's two concepts here, really, idea and mutual engagements. Let's start with the second one. Mutual engagements mean we start to see ourselves in a collective identity, that my identity is no longer autonomous, but that it's actually subordinate and connected to a group or collective in which my identity, I am only a fragment of the whole. The community is really the whole, and I am just a piece. Whereas man in the state of nature, every human being was their own individual whole. We think about the game going on with halves and wholes in Aristophanes' speech. The whole implication is that I don't really exist independently. I am dependent on another being that is really just an extension of myself. The other important word is idea. How are ideas manifest? They're only manifest in speech. So what we also see is Rousseau's discussion of the development of language and it becoming a medium of reflection by which human beings are made more conscious of themselves. They become capable of not just describing the world, but the creative power of speech creates entities that we then subordinate ourselves to, like the family, the community, the church, and on, the bowling league, whatever it is. And then I have obligations to the bowling league on Friday night or Saturday night, and so on and so forth, right? Where are we? But only as far as present and perceptible interest could require. So what is he saying here? We started forming mutual engagements to do temporary tasks, and then we retreated back to our solitary status. The problem is, over time, circumstances will dictate that we form alliances to achieve our ends because we're needy, and then all of a sudden, instead of breaking those alliances and going back to our solitary condition, there was some kernel event in circumstance that kept us together, and basically we resulted in forming our collective identity. But only as far as present and perceptible interest could require, for foresight was nothing to them, because we don't have rational foresight. We're in the process of developing. This is like a semi-coate human being who doesn't have full speech. They're like the caveman who's becoming aware of things and being able to give voice to them, or being able to give voice to them and therefore being able to become aware of them. Far from being concerned with a distant future. Now think about, remember, the family deals with, household deals with immediate needs, the village deals with long-term needs. He's playing right into Aristotle. For Rousseau, the family is not natural. Sex is natural. The caring for the young of a family is not natural. The man, he's gone after he finishes the job. The woman, well, the baby is literally part of her, so she's attached to it, and it's also highly dependent because it can't live on its own. But the moment that child becomes independent, there is no notion of that woman being a mother anymore for Rousseau. Rousseau sees the family as a product of society, a construct of society. It is not a naturally occurring thing. It's another radical claim of Rousseau that's very intriguing and also controversial. If a deer was to be caught, everyone clearly sensed that it required him faithfully to keep his post. He's talking about the development of a division of labor and organization amongst individuals. And they're going to identify as a team, right? Rather than just as a bunch of people in the same place. But if a hare happen to pass within reach of one of them, he will, without a doubt, have chased after it without a scruple, and after catching his prey, have cared very little about having caused his companions to miss theirs. Right? So what are we seeing? We're seeing the very gradual development of group identity based on experiences and our ability to articulate them in speech. And this will lead us to become the social animal, despite the fact that we were not originally social. We have the capacity to become social, but we were not destined to become social. Okay, let's just sum up very quickly. What have we done in these last few slides? We've established the origins of human sociality, which he says is not natural or not given, and also the origins of conflict, which lead to inequality. Okay, through this historical process of external circumstances impinging on human beings, basically priming the use of their minds in ways that would make them more conscious, more aware, and inspire the greater use of their reason and the development of speech. And that these were really circumstantial things, that we had the raw potential, but a circumstance brought it out. And in fact, this is very consistent with evolutionary analysis of how various traits develop in animals. It's a very, you might say, just modern understanding, a very scientific understanding. Notice, the man is just a machine. He acknowledges that there is no supernatural endowment in the human being. In the 18th century, that's still a controversial topic. Certainly there were many thinkers who were bold enough to say man is a machine, but that was not the status quo, and that was not the popular view. So it's a fairly radical claim. So let's talk about what natural man really is. Couple things. Natural man is a savage without full speech. Natural man is man stripped. Imagine you've got clothes on and you're stripped off and you're bare naked. Natural, and those clothes are the conventions of nature. Excuse me, the conventions, an oxymoron, the conventions of society, conventions of morality, conventions of political power. The natural man is stripped of all those conventions, and this is what's left. Those conventions are the product of language and its ideas, and those ideas being consensually agreed upon and enforced on people. So let's look at this picture for a moment. He says, let us conclude that wandering in the forests, without industry, without speech, without settled abode, without war, and without tie or ties to other beings, without any need of others, of his kind, and without any desire to harm them, perhaps even without even recognizing any one of them individually, subject to a few passions and self-sufficient. Savage man had only the sentiments and the enlightenment, the use of his reason, suited to this state, that he sensed only his true needs, looked only at what he believed it to be in his interest to see, and that his intelligence made no more progress than his vanity. So intelligence, use of our reason, is tied to our vanity. That is a theme as old. A theme is as old as the Old Testament and the Genesis story. He's in the forest, isolated. He lives without industry. You know, he's not developing the arts and sciences. He doesn't have speech. Therefore, he doesn't have the ideas and the cognitive powers to apply to the world. They're potential, but they're not been realized. Without settled abode, he doesn't have any notion of his identity connected to a specific place or another group of people. Abode is almost always going to imply group, right? Because once you're fixed, you're with other people. Without war, he's pacifistic, and we'll see why. Without any tie to other. It's the ties that others that are going to create conflict. Particularly, he doesn't need others. He's self-sufficient because his passions are few and his needs are limited. And because he's basically a wild animal, he has the wherewithal, the resiliency to satisfy those desires fairly easily, because he's a robust being, not like the decrepit person who spends 12 hours in front of the computer for 7 days a week. We become a lump, right? Especially when we can't go to the gym. And because he's self-sufficient, he's not dependent on other people. And because his reason isn't developed, he doesn't have pride, and he doesn't feel the need to dominate others. So he's just a being that naturally, intrinsically minds his own business because he has no reason to bother other people in their business. We notice other thing, he does not even recognize his children. He doesn't identify the other person as being connected to him in any other way. I think this is the antithesis of the Aristophanes speech, in which the other person is my missing half that I'm desiring to reunite. This savage is a whole, and the others are wholes that should just mind their own business instead of entering into conflict. So in the state of nature, man is not social. And the state of nature, since this is a story of the history of our psychology, is connected with certain sentiments. We have natural sentiments of existence and pity. Our sentiment of existence is driven by our desire for self-preservation on its most basic level, and simply to preserve our own physical being and perpetuate it. There's a very limited number of things we really need. We don't need a red sports car. We don't need a mansion. We don't need a jetliner to fly us around. Right? Those are things that emerge in civil society because we're in a contest of vanity, Vanity Fair with other people. Competition in the state of nature is highly limited. Imagine two individuals competing for an apple, since there's only one and they can only find one in the vicinity, and they're both hungry at this point, let's say. They're not actually directly competing with one another. They're both competing for the apple, and in the process of competing for that apple, they enter into conflict. But they're not entering into conflict because they want to dominate one or another. It's only a byproduct of their core desire for survival. And whoever gets that apple, right, is winning for the sake of the apple and not for the sake of dominating the other being. With the emergence of amour propre, our desires are coupled to our imaginations and our collective ideas of merit. It's coupled with seeing ourselves through the eyes of others. Comparison will become competition. Competition becomes conflict, and conflict breeds winners and losers within certain factions of society, one who wields power and one who does not. Therefore, conflict produces inequality. So if we just look at some of the basic distinctions here between natural man and civilized man, we see that natural man is solitary, asocial, independent. He's a wild animal, right? He doesn't need the help of masters and servants. What is a domesticated dog? They're a servant. They're a slave of the master because they get fed by the master. So therefore they have to perform tricks for the master if they want to get fed. And they know that, and they're really just relying on their own survival instinct, but within the context of this domesticated circumstance, right? He has limited needs. The wild animal they just have the needs of survival. They need just food. They don't need, for example, like a steak and a good Cabernet. Man lives out in nature. He's strong and robust. He's adapted to the wild environment. He's adapted to its rigors. So he has the power to satisfy his own needs on his own because his needs are limited. And his strength, what did we say the lack of self-sufficiency is a result of? We have needs of our bodies that cannot be satisfied under the powers of those bodies. A quirk of nature. Rousseau's saying the opposite, saying natural man is self-sufficient because his needs are so limited or sufficiently limited, and his powers are sufficient that he can satisfy his needs on his own. Therefore, he's free. If I can provide for myself, I am not dependent on another. If I am not dependent on another, my own will dictates. If I can't satisfy my own needs by myself, I need the help of the other. If I need the help of the other person to survive, I am dependent on them, and I am at their mercy, and I am a slave. This is a basic analysis of Rousseau, and Thomas Jefferson said the exact same thing. And it's why the welfare state is so destructive to so many societies, cities across the country. Because it breeds not independence, it breeds dependence. and it's a self-perpetuating system that doesn't liberate anybody from the problems that it claims to liberate them from. Civilized man is social, meaning he naturally sees himself as part of a group. He's domesticated like the house pet. The slave or the servant or the peasant or the commoner is just like the dog in the house. The dog needs the master because that's where the food comes from. They don't wrest it from the natural world on their own. They're dependent. They live in a world of amour propre, or amour propre is often translated as vanity or pride. They have needs that can only be satisfied with the help of others. Now, there's two reasons why. Number one, those needs are sufficiently large that they can only be satisfied with the help of others. They're just too big. Number two, we're weak. We're made dependent in society. We're made just a part rather than a whole. And then number three, the very things that we might get from society, the things that we might want only come from other people in society. The society, in a sense, has to give them to us, right? So it creates up a kind of racket in which we're made dependent. In the same way, like the Catholic Church says, you have original sin, and by the way, I have the solution and the cure, the remedy for your original sin. And they set up a power structure there. We're weak, we're tame, we're domesticated, we're dependent, and therefore we're enslaved. That's how Rousseau sees it. We're subjects. In 18th century Europe, we're subjects of the king. That literally means kind of subordinates of the king. We're not citizens. We're not self-governing. This is one of the interesting things. Our desires are never satisfied, and yet in civil society, natural scarcity is largely conquered because of the productivity of society. So in civil society, we have all these goods and all these services provided for us. And yet, it's not enough. And the question is why. There's a difference between an economy of needs and an economy of wants. Natural man has an economy of needs, the bare minimum to survive. But in civilized society, we can never have enough. And the question is, why can we never have enough? Right? So even today, what is called the poverty level is nothing like what it was described as, say, 100 years ago. Now, you may say that's moral progress, but the point is this. Poverty is almost always defined by relative economic well-being rather than absolute economic well-being. And the difference between natural man and civilized man is that natural man bases his well-being on absolute needs, like there is a bare minimum to survive, and once I have that, I'm liberated from providing for their needs and I can do other things. Whereas civilized man, the magnitude of the needs and the nature of the needs is always going up. I have to have this, I have to have this, and I always have to work harder, and I have to have this. And these are not really needs anymore. They are wants. On another hand, they are needs, because you're no longer talking about the game of survival in the state of nature, in the wilderness. You're talking about survival in civil society, where there's a whole different set of rules. And survival means getting by in the rat race, as opposed to, physical survival of the body. So we're going to break this up a little more. In the next lecture, we're going to look very specifically at amour de soi-même and amour propre, as these are psychological manifestations of natural man and civilized man, and really nail down what these two concepts of self-love are.